Well, thank you, Mickey, for that interesting presentation on managing remote software development, which feels quite apropos because your panel here is geographically dispersed across actually the West Coast. We're in the same time zone, but we're spread many thousand miles apart right now. Mickey, there have been a few questions that have come up that some of them came again ahead of time for people who couldn't attend this live session, and some that popped up in the chat. Let me start off with asking you a question about time, distance, and culture. You say they're important. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. Just when I was talking to one of the GitLab managers, directors I quoted in the presentation, he started out my when I first started talking to him, he said, I want to thank you for giving me a piece of information when I work for you that has been the most important thing for me during my employment at GitLab. He says that was time, the importance of time, distance, and culture. He says, I've used that so much. And so really what's so important about it is that when you go to hire someone, or if they're hired and you have to interact with them, understanding how much time can impact that interaction, okay, if they're half a world away, excuse me, as it was when I was managing teams in India, 12 and a half hours away, somebody was always inconvenienced if we wanted to talk directly. So a lot of communication via email, but you really have to have high bandwidth communication to be effective on occasion. So, the time is important. The distance, of course, is less important when everybody's remote, except for the fact that sometimes you want to be together. One of the most important things I ever learned, at least as a personal lesson from me, was that when I take and have to really understand someone, I can do it via remote, I can do it via phone, I can do it via Zoom, but taking and having eye-to-eye communication in person over dinner or just a meeting, thereafter, somehow the communication is always easier. Mm-hmm. So the distance is important, and you want to take and be able to actually have live conversations whenever it's possible. Hopefully in the next coming months and years, it'll be more possible than it is now even. And finally, culture. Well, of course, culture in this particular context is the culture of the person you're talking to or you're dealing with. Understanding the cultural differences in India, the differences in Japan, and trying to use those to make sure that you're not doing faux pas in their culture, and to understand when they don't understand your culture. So the cultural aspect here is very important. Now, Ron earlier talked about company culture. Now that's different than the culture I'm talking about here. Also very important, but the culture here is more about the individual's culture.
Right, and that seems to me to be one of the more difficult of those challenges that you listed. Cultural alignment seems to be the most difficult, actually, for me. Like, okay, now I recognize that there's different cultures for the norms in India, other countries, even within the US, different populations. What any advice on how to to understand the different cultures and expectations, and then how to align teams to a common culture?
Well, that to me is challenging. I think the most important is to take and make sure you have a set of values set for your company that help define the culture. If you go into our book, we talk about sometimes you have to wall off the culture of your company and create your own set of values and the culture in the group you're managing. Because if the company culture is toxic to what you're doing, you don't want to bring that in. You want to wall it off. So establishing the cultures that represent the values you have, then trying to get others in these remote teams that they can embrace those cultures and abide by them. I think that's the best you can do.
I think I'd add one note, which is holidays. So one of the things you find out when you start managing people in other countries is they have different holidays, and those holidays can be revealing about culture. And so that's interesting from that standpoint.
Yeah, and also just while you're mentioning holidays, understanding those holidays and actually mapping them out. Because, for example, I always had to take an almost wall off January as a development period because in India and in China, much of January is taken off as a holiday. So you have to take and understand those things when you're trying to make plans around your teams that may not be in those places.
The summertime in Europe is interesting. I'll use my mother's use of the word interesting. Summertime in Europe is interesting.
Yes,
sure.
August. Yeah, Europe in August.
Europe in August.
Yeah. And so you mentioned, Nikki, about the importance of a good internet connection. Maybe we can reflect a little bit more on the hardware you talked about. You brought up Google sort of several $1,000 room audio kits. How important is audio visual equipment? Is there any kind of minimum that you think is important? And let me add that we have CDDD, which I believe is Cortland, has some opinions on that. He feels that audio quality is sometimes overlooked, which means the microphones, the headsets, earbuds I'm wearing now, the treatment for room acoustics. And for Cortland, for instance, he uses, for his day-to-day use, he uses a headset, a mic on a boom, which is attached to headphones. Can you speak a little bit about having sort of like a good audio setup for your remote individuals on your team?
Sure, I'll give you an example of this. I learned very quickly when we're doing animations and video is that if you can't keep up to the video, you got to make sure the audio never drops out. So the audio always has priority over video. So paying attention to audio is a very good thing. It's the most important aspect of it. Now, today it's amazing what you can get for very little. I recently upgraded the camera I'm looking at now, and I think it cost me less than $100. That was an upgrade. Just a high def camera that goes, and I'm using for Zoom. The audio, I can't speak to it because you're listening to it and I'm not, but I think it's okay. But I agree that people should take and invest in quality equipment if they're going to be online doing remote teams like we're doing all of us in the world, it seems like nowadays. Don't scrimp on that.
Yeah, I was in a meeting of folks who were probably not, it's just one of these Zoom meetings, but the team isn't particularly technology aware. And one of the people on the meeting, I was the new person who joined. He's like, "Oh my God, your audio is so good. What do you do?" I was like, "Well, I just have earbuds." Everybody else was using the mic and the speaker in their laptops. And small things like that can make really big differences.
Indeed.
Yeah, another question from Cortland is, and perhaps maybe we can figure out how to make a little sense of it, is comments on the difference between espoused values, like values and action. Can either you, Ron, or Mickey try to see what he's getting at there?
So I think it goes, if we go back and revisit what Ron was talking about earlier about Enron, okay, they espoused a lot of values, okay, but they didn't live them. In fact, they were 180 degrees opposite often in the way they ran their company. So taking and understanding the values that are espoused and the values you actually want to see. For example, you may not want your teams to emulate the way your managers work or the CEO works. Maybe he doesn't embrace the values even though he espouses them. So, actions often speak louder than words. So make sure that you follow the values and you are leadership in being and embodying the values that you really want to embrace.
Yeah, I'll give you another example. When I was at Charles Schwab, and I was at Charles Schwab for almost 7 years, Schwab had wonderful values that in my experience, at least at that time, that Schwab lived those values. And there are values like fairness and values of teamwork and values of relentlessly delivering value to our customers. And I was leading an initiative at one point at Schwab. I was leading an initiative for our CIO to basically create teamwork across all of the software development organizations. So across 1,500 software developers who up until that point had been able to choose any software they wanted, any platform they wanted. So you can imagine our data center was supporting Microsoft technologies and Java technologies and C++ and pretty much every language that existed other than Spitball and Snowball. I'm pretty sure we didn't have any Spitball or Snowball in our data center, but pretty much everything else. And so we were trying to unify that. And one of the things that I was trying to create was this environment. It was a culture of sharing. Culture of sharing fit very well with some of those values, but the relentless delivery of software too often caused developers to put on blinders, like the horse blinders that we see from the 1800s, put on blinders and not learn from the very developer who was sitting next to them, not share what they were learning with the developer sitting next to them. And so what I then found having to do was to emphasize one value over another, and that value of teamwork I had to emphasize over the value of relentlessly delivering software to our customers, because ultimately that culture of sharing was going to result over the middle and long term in delivering much more software to our customers by not blocking ourselves off from each other.
And probably better software.
Mm-hmm. And that too.
Yeah, Cortland's is chiming in, agreeing with you in some sense that values and action really come to play when you have those difficult situations. And research shows that there can be a gap between espousing and living to your values when things are running easily and then when things get really tough. But let me follow on this sort of tool thing that you brought up, Ron. One of the things I found is challenging is introducing a new tool. So as a manager, as a leader, and you talk some of these dev analytics tools, Mickey, there's a whole bunch of them we could talk about, but let's say you as a manager wants to bring in a new tool or use a new tool. Can you talk to what it takes to get your team to buy into using this new tool and feel comfortable using the tool and spending the time to learn how to use it? Can you talk about introducing a new tool and making it effective in your team?
Well, I'll back up a little bit. Before you bring in a tool, make sure your organization is ready for the tool as well. For example, if there's cost, you better make sure it's budgeted and that your CFO has bought into it as well. So if you don't have buy-in from the company, going in and spending a lot of time on a tool, which they then won't support and purchase, is needless. So save your time and money, or money you don't have, I guess. But going back to what you do with tools, in your team, and especially with some of these dev analytics tools, the team could feel that you don't trust them. They feel like they don't,
right.
You're trying to spy on them, but really you're not. You're trying to help them be better. The analogy I like to use for these kind of tools is, if you look at the sports world today, okay, any baseball game, any football game, it's any tennis game, any golf game, you look at those games and it's filled with information about how the team or the individual is doing. Okay, do you think these players push back at that? No, they actually embrace it because it helps them be better people, better players. And so if your team as software programmers feel that these tools are kind of giving too much information they don't want to share, well, they should embrace it as a way to help them be better programmers. So you have to educate them. You've got to be careful on becoming heavy-handed with it in any way. These tools, it depends on which ones you choose, but they can be very illuminating, help you do management of these projects better and faster and more effectively. But if they're heavy-handed, it's going to take and lower the morale of your team and cause problems in another area. So there's a careful balance here, but go slow and take your time, and don't try to change 180 degrees overnight. By the way, learning these tools is not easy. It takes a long time to take and ramp up on them. So embrace them is not something to be undertaken lightly.
Yes. So two questions. One is, can you get sort of unintended consequences from the tools? I looked at the presentation where you talk about you have circles and diamonds, and there's these little circles and these big circles. And as a software developer, I want to have big circles. And can that create sort of perhaps like code bloat, or depends on how the tool measures it, or it's like unintended consequences of this measurement?
Right, right. So one of the fears of these kinds of tools is you're going to be rewarding the wrong things. I was reading a post the other day. Someone said, if I use this, then all of the changes, I had a developer who went back and created more aligned to all the comments in all of the code. Okay, so they're not meaningful changes, would have showed he had done a bunch of changes. Right. So you can't just look at the numbers, you've got to look beyond them. Okay. But if you're trying to help the team, okay, you're going to know that this guy, he couldn't make that many changes. He's not our top developer. He's off commenting code. I'm going to ignore that. But then look at the people who actually are contributing and see how they're doing. So, you have to work it out. But I think that it's the kind of tool that was well worth the time and effort you have to spend to take and do it right.
Yeah,
We're edging into we're actually a little more edged into than edging into the topic of metrics. One of my more recent blog posts began with the words, "Don't ever, ever, ever let velocity be used as a measure of productivity or performance." And the reason, one of the reasons for that is so I shared this with a client in Arizona, and the client was the group of people just lit up. They said, "Oh yeah, we've got a rule of thumb for that. What gets measured gets manipulated."
Mm-hmm.
And it's the best, one of the most concise rules of thumb I think I've run across is what gets measured gets manipulated. And what happens with velocity is if someone outside the team starts measuring velocity, starts watching velocity, and the team becomes aware of that, they will start manipulating it. And you can make velocity go up really fast. All you have to do is change the point sizes on your stories. And velocity will up. The number of stories that are getting done, the amount of delight of our customers, the outcomes, nothing changes, but velocity goes up. And it's a bad thing. And the side effect of that is that because velocity is now manipulated, velocity is no longer useful as a measure for the team to use to be predictable. And so
can I make a counterpoint to that, Ron?
Yes, please do.
That point of view is very cynical. You believe that your team doesn't want to improve. Do you think that velocity, knowing how your velocity is doing, isn't a valid thing to understand?
Yes. So the team. So that was my point. Don't ever let it be used outside of the team. The team needs velocity in order to be predictable. The team needs velocity in order to understand how it's doing.
So you as your manager, are you part of the team or not?
The team needs that internal feedback. So I started a blog post, or started a discussion group on this a year ago or so, and one of the contributors said, we don't let velocity leak outside of the team. And I thought that was a really useful way of putting it. Is we don't let it leak outside the team. We use it really validly and usefully inside the team.
So you as a manager shouldn't know about it?
So it depends on the instance of Agile whether I'm part of the team or not. But the as part of, so we're sort of part of the team and sort of not part of the team. And so
is that yes or no?
But letting the management outside of our organization, letting the CEO know about it, letting sales know.
Promoting it as a valuable measure. Yes, don't promote it. I absolutely agree. But you as a manager can use it as a useful tool.
Yeah, and as a useful tool for the team's learning.
Yes, for the team.
Yeah.
So we're in heated agreement.
I think
Oh.
we're in violent agreement, Nikki, as we usually are.
Yeah, all right. So here's another question. You talk, Mickey, about trust but verify. And so to what extent, well, can you talk a little bit more about that? And in the extent you want to build trust with your team, but then you're verifying that they've done what they said they were going to do, whereas it seems like that's a conflict.
Oh, not at all. So let me give you an example, a couple of examples. First of all, one, which I don't think I've ever shared in public before, my experience with one of my companies. So I was part of the executive team, and as such, we looked at financial reports once a month and understood things. And one day, our banker called, said, we're worried. We just, excuse me, a venture capitalist, one of our VCs on the board, called to say, we just got a call from your bank, and they said they were not going to be able to make payroll. We said, we just had a meeting, and our accountant said that the payroll, we had plenty of money in the bank to pay payroll. So we went to talk to the accountant, and he had left with his laptop that morning and hadn't come back from lunch yet, which was several hours later. Well, it turns out this accountant had been writing checks personal to himself and not keeping track, not making them visible to the accounting system. Okay, so we trusted this guy, but we didn't ever verify it. We immediately implemented rules whereby no one could write a check without two signatures. Okay, so that's a result of that trust but verify. Going back to programmers, which is a little bit smaller sort of situation, I had an awareness of someone who was working. They were a friend of mine, but they were working remotely for a company full-time on the East Coast. And they worked every day. They got up early and they worked, for the company. But it turns out they also had a full-time job with a company here on the West Coast. Okay, so they were working two full-time jobs, basically 16 hours a day, for which they were really only working maybe 12. Okay, so someone should have noticed that there was something wrong here. Either one of those companies, they did it for years and got away. So they were looking at results, which is good. But I don't believe they ever got the full amount of result they could have got from this person. So sometimes you got to look at the tea leaves to try to understand, okay, this person says what they're saying, but is it really happening? And that's this cartoon I put up on the in the presentation kind of alluded to that. I'm completely swamped. Okay, well, they're in the swamp, right? So sometimes you have to look beyond what people say. You have to trust them, but sometimes you have to verify too.
Ron, do you have anything to add to that, since you guys were in violent agreement before? Is that?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that Amy Edmondson said about we're not just trying to create a culture of psychological safety. We're also setting standards and set standards of expectation for our teams, and those are standards that we're going to verify against, that we're going to get confirmation of.
Now, let me loop back to one more question on tools. Mickey, you showed a large number of dev analytics tools. And if I've bought into something this is important for my team and I want to do it, it seems like there's like just an overwhelming number of choices, and I can spend way too much time like trying to decide which tool to pick and do an evaluation of them. Or if we take a step back to like, I want to do dev analytics, but I don't want to spend huge amounts of time picking a tool. Do you have any advice for how to go about taking that first step?
Well, so I've been trying to understand these tools myself, and I'm far from understanding all of them. That's for sure. But I found this particular link I put up there is kind of useful, which is an analysis mostly from customer reviews, okay, a ranking of the best tools in this particular space. So customer reviews count for a lot. So that's one place to go to look for some guidance. But I think that going beyond that, one of the things you have to do as you take and evaluate a tool is you have to see what they say and what it actually does. And the only way to really do that is to ask for a couple of references and talk to the people who are using it.
And that's not different from, are we choosing a language? Are we choosing a platform? Are we choosing a framework? We getting those references, getting those customer reviews, getting insight into it. It starts with what it is we're trying to get out of that tool. And all of the people on this call probably have some subtle differences between what it is we're trying to get out of that kind of a tool. And so we need to start with the requirements.
Right. And also make sure you do a test project. Don't just jump in feet first, into the deep end of the pool. Wade in through the shallow end and take and make sure you understand the tool and do it on a small number of things, not a big number of things. That's my recommendation.
And we have a couple more comments in our chat about getting back to culture and leadership, and particularly one of the cultures that got picked up was the Indian culture, where there's the expectation that the manager is a leader and in control, and perhaps different than some of the other cultures that come out of more global countries or from a more mix of them. Is there kind of any other, particularly if you're working with a culture, that the expectation within that culture is strong leadership, but it's our desire to build, what's the Aristotle project from the Google about equal communication? I thought that was really interesting, Ron, that Google's high performing teams, everyone spent sort of equal amount of time talking. How do you sort of work with some cultures that don't consider that to be strong leadership, where other perhaps really analytically different given companies like Google say, well, actually that's what works best?
Well, quite frankly, let me just jump in for a second. Maybe Ron can pick it up after that, but I think that what's best for you isn't necessarily what Google says. What works for a company with unlimited dollars, okay, and an unlimited number of people isn't necessarily good for a startup. So be careful about emulating Google in all things. That said, in this particular thing, it might make sense to take and make your teams more communicate better. But I think you have to be careful emulating Google, Microsoft, Apple, these companies with $1 trillion market cap and unlimited funds and so forth.
So I'm going to disagree with Mickey on this one. On this particular point, that I think that equality and conversational turn taking is a useful measure regardless of where our team is. I've talked to a ton of startup managers and startup directors and VPs of engineering and CTOs, and about that question, Tammy, which is, how do we bring that kind of conversational turn taking to other cultures? And what I find is that that while the culture itself may support something different, we can find those people who are those programmers for our teams who have that, who are willing to step up and be proactive and be part of a self-organizing team. And we can find people who are reticent to do that here in the United States as well. And if that's the team, and it goes back to requirements, if that's the team we're trying to build, then maybe some of you want to build micromanaged teams. I hope not. I hope not for the benefit of your teams. But what are your requirements for your team? Those are the requirements that we need to look for in the managers we hire for those teams and in the programmers who are going to be part of those teams. So I often talk to Agile, to startups more often than not, but also to very large companies. If you brought in a summer intern, that equality and conversational turn taking applies to the summer intern as well. And it's not because the summer intern is going to architect your system, although I've had some pretty remarkable summer interns, but probably they're not going to architect the whole system. But if you don't have an intern who is bringing some experience and some expertise and cannot step up and share that at the appropriate time when that expertise or experience might be useful to your team, if they don't have that something extra, you probably hired the wrong intern.
Yep. Yes, I've had some excellent internships too. So, Mickey, question for you directly from Frank. Any suggestions on how to pick remote teams, e.g. teams in India, to help startups? And I assume this is a startup here in the US and needs extra engineering help and is looking to find a remote team in India to help them. Any suggestions on how to pick them?
Well, so I have, it's been quite a number of years since I was managing teams in India, so things have progressed a long ways. So I think that understanding what their core competencies are there is key, okay? And making sure you bring those core competencies into your team if you need them. And if those core competencies don't align with your needs, then they're probably not the right team. So it's like hiring a person on steroids to hire a team or a team of programmers in India or any other place, quite frankly. You've got to be very careful about what you do. And again, wade in from the shallow end of the pool. Don't just dive into the deep end. You've got to start and be able to back off and terminate a contract if necessary, if it's not working out. And don't be afraid to do that.
And if you're hiring a team from anywhere, whether they're in the United States or whether they're in Canada or whether they're in India or China or Eastern Europe or South America, get some references of folks who worked with that organization, and now you can have a conversation about what you're looking for, about what they were looking for when they brought that team in, and what they got, and what that you can have some really insightful conversations with other people who've used that vendor.
How important is it when you're hiring a remote team that you or your team has some skill set, that you have the skill set that you're hiring for? So as an example, say your team is deep into database and data science, and that's in sort of back-end server technologies, and you're looking for help in the graphical user interface, React, Angular, sort of front end. How important is it that you have some of that sort of React, Angular, whichever the graphical interface you want, expertise it yourself, versus that's something that you can completely outsource?
So there's a couple of different situations there. First of all, if you're hiring consultants, they're not full-time employees, you might look for something different than if you're trying to hire full-time. Okay, if you're trying to hire full-time, you don't necessarily have to have all those experiences, okay, although you have to be able to judge whether they're doing it accurately and adequately. Okay, so you have to know enough about it to be able to manage it. Okay, but if you're hiring consultants, you're looking actually for people who actually have expertise that you don't have. Okay, and you're trying to bring that in usually for a limited amount of time until you can build that expertise internally, or if the project is of finite duration, you don't need it anymore. But I've hired consultants as experts where I have no idea what they're doing, specifically to solve specific problems for me. So it really depends on the situation.
So
even when we're bringing in employees and consultants into areas that we've got patents in, if we've been managing for very long, we become more and more separated from the technology itself. Our skill set, we're hiring people who are better than we are. I'm always, I don't know about you, but I'm always hiring people who are better than I am.
So to that extent, if it is something that you don't have sort of depth in, how can you evaluate whether your consultant, your external team, is doing a good job?
Well, how do you determine whether anyone is doing a good job? But frankly, it's driven by results. If they're not delivering results that you can quantify, then you're probably not managing it correctly.
Right. So we're running, it's past sort of 11:30 here on the West Coast. Ron or Mickey, do you have anything that you wanted me to have asked you, or is there anything that you want to add as we're sort of wrapping up our session here?
I think, yeah, the summary of my own talk is worth repeating, which is that there is real gratification to be had in managing, and you have to be willing to let go of the incredible ecstasy of solving hard programming problems, and recognize that what you're doing is creating an environment for an entire team or an entire organization to get that ecstasy, and that we are together building an opportunity for delighting customers.
And just let me go back to what I would like to summarize is managing remotely is hard. It's even harder than managing all these programmers we've been doing over the years because of the distance, time, and culture aspects that impede communication. So we have a favorite saying in our book, which is you can never over communicate. And I think that in managing remotely, that goes double. So managing programmers remotely is a challenge. Communicate as much as you can and do as much as you can to make it even easier on yourself and on them.